Thank you for joining me once again on the Southern Report. I've just had my quicker intro because my dear guest that I'm bringing on now, who I think is the most, I'm calling him a sage. I call him one of my favorite thinkers because there is no doubt about it. When you follow his work, when he's on social media, what he does is raise a smile and at times makes me laugh out loud. So, writer extraordinaire, written a book about cultural Marxism, written a book on Bill Gates. His latest book up there, F the Planet. He will quickly describe that and where you can get all his stuff from. I'm just going to bring on my dear friend Daniel. We will have a discussion and bring you up to date on one or two huge issues that are happening on this side of the pond in the UK. Daniel, thank you so much, my dear sage of wonderful humor, but
Well,
actually
thanks for the intro and for
piercing.
having me again.
No, it's great. It's great to see you. I want to start off straight from the offset because I remember to do this at the end of our chat. Where can people find you, find your Substack, find your books, etc.?
Yeah, my Substack is Jutlandia. So if you go on Substack and look for Jutlandia, you should find it. Um, I put out most of my writing there. I'm also on Facebook if anyone wants to send a friend request under Daniel Jupp, obviously. And those are probably the two best places to contact me.
Brilliant. Can you remind people what books you've written and where they can find those as well?
Yeah, my first book was a sort of semi self published, but I had a friend who's a fellow patriot who very generously funded the publication of that one, and that's called A Gift for Treason: The Cultural Marxist Assault on Western Civilization. So in
Yeah,
that one, I described, quite often we don't define our terms. So I described what Western civilization is, what's valuable about it, and why it needs to be protected and cherished, and the cultural Marxist assault on it. So this kind of very modern revision of all our history, all our national identity, and this idea that the kind of Western world is responsible for the ills of the world.
brilliant.
So it tackles all of that, and it covers a sort of 2,500 year sweep of history. So it's probably the most comprehensive look at Western civilization in a single volume that anyone's written. And it's not as kind of vast as you would think that would make it in page count.
Right.
The next book was a sort of much more drilled down, much more focused effort, and that was released by Bombardier Books.
Yeah.
Um, all of my books are still available on Amazon, or the two Bombardier published ones you can get direct from Bombardier. So the second book discussed Bill Gates and was really about the network of power and influence that he's created, examining that, saying what's anti-democratic and wrong with that, and, for example, discussing his impact on COVID measures. So, that was a much more drilled down piece, but it was a kind of examination of one of the kind of billionaire believers in cultural Marxism, if you like, who is a problem today. The third book is much more about what you do as an individual, especially if you're powerless. So you may think the world's going completely mad. You may disagree with many of the policies your government is bringing in, and you may feel that you have no representation and no voice. So the F the Planet book is about what you can do as an individual to protect yourself under globalist governments. Because we found that there's this kind of anarcho tyranny that takes place with
Yeah.
globalist leadership, where
Yeah.
if you're a traditionalist, if you're a patriot, if you're a libertarian, your rights are getting more and more restricted. Your freedom of speech is being curtailed, and this is happening across the Western world. But at the same time, there's more crime, there's more violence. They're importing people with savage values, and those people aren't policed effectively at all. So, there's this double standard, and obviously Keir Starmer is one of the biggest representations of that in the UK at the moment.
Absolutely, and wonderful. And the thing about your third book is the fact that you do lay out advice, you lay out actions that can be taken, which are, and we discussed last time, and also the fact that there is a link between wonderfully between all three, and that's all credit. That is all credit to you as well. And I think one, let's just say this because we may end up discussing this later, but let's just remind our listeners, viewers, the fact that Bill Gates and Larry Fink of BlackRock sat down with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, and Rachel Reeves and others before our budget of the first budget they put forward, I think in October and November. They sat down with them. What's very, very interesting is that all the pictures are on the internet. There's a wonderful independent journalist, who's done the freedom of information on what was that discussion about. And that's just to give an illustration of how bad things have got. People need to educate themselves on that.
Yeah,
Daniel,
and it's.
sorry,
I mean that thing of private meetings in which are not recorded and the contents of which are not disclosed shouldn't be things in a modern democracy that are happening. There's no reason for it, and there's no reason why. Throughout the COVID crisis, the manufactured COVID crisis, Bill Gates was in constant personal communication with world leaders. So Angela Merkel in Germany, Boris Johnson at the time in the UK, and organisations that have been funded by Bill Gates were giving advice on a weekly basis to government at the same time. And this was, true across the Western world. So we let a private individual who had no elected manifesto to do so essentially guide and dictate global pandemic response. And, he guided it in disastrous ways, as we've seen since.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that meeting, all the thing is that it puts us with what we know to be deeply, deeply suspicious, especially when you've got people like Larry Fink there at BlackRock, and of course of Bill Gates and his history, even though there's still lots of denial of that. Daniel, we want to talk about this. I want your opinion on this because you've been researching this. There has been a television series that has hit the television over here. Do you want to describe this series, where it's being shown, and the background to all of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously everyone's probably heard of it and discussed it to an extent already because this has been going on for a couple of weeks now. But it's the Netflix series Adolescents, and we've had this utterly insane response to it, which it's been a hit on Netflix. There's no denying that it's well acted, it's well written, it's well produced, it's a slick production. But essentially, it's the story of an encounter at a school and a boy who's bullied, who then it turns out, I don't think I'm giving away any spoilers here, kills a girl. And it's a 13-year-old white boy with a loving father. And, we've had this reaction. Keir Starmer made a public statement, which is very, very bizarre. He made a public statement saying how much this production had moved him, that he'd sat down and watched it with all his family. We've had other Labour MPs getting incredibly irate at Conservative MPs who said they haven't seen it, which is, this is what they're engaged in. This is what they're concerned about, whether someone has watched a TV show. And Keir Starmer referred to Adolescence as a documentary, which is a bit worrying because it shows that he doesn't know the difference between fact and fiction.
Yes. Well said.
So,
brilliantly said.
And the kind of really, really disturbing thing about it is that it's being used as a justification for policy change. And it's being used as a justification for, we've seen Adolescence, it raises these issues, we're going to have, we've agreed with Netflix, you know, the producers and writers and makers of Netflix and the actors were invited to a Downing Street meeting. You know, the Prime Minister was setting aside time for this, and they brainstormed with Keir Starmer. You know, I don't know how much brain was involved there, but, you know, that's another matter. And they come up with the idea that the Netflix show will be shown for free in all British schools to children. Right, so you've got a fictional show which they are making part of the school curriculum, essentially, and they're taking the supposed lessons of the show, which is essentially that young white boys are radicalized by online content, and, you know, they're the threat to our children that we should be worried and concerned about, because it's you know, what this country is experiencing is apparently a wave of 13-year-old white boys harming other children. Well, you know, everyone knows that isn't the case. Everyone knows that that is purely fictional. You know, you might have white gang members, you might have, you know, 13-year-old white boys involved with crime, but the primary causes of harm to children in this country have been from other sources, and we all know what those sources are. You know, the primary sources of harm at the moment are Muslim communities, Pakistani descended Muslim communities that have gang raped girls for 30 years in the UK, you know, children for 30 years in the UK. So my issue with Adolescence is partly that it's a deflection from the real issues and the real problems that we should be concentrating on. And it's a deliberate deflection, I think. That's why it's been taken up politically by many members of the Labour Party, who at the same time are refusing to hold a national inquiry into grooming gangs. You know, and at council level, there's various Labour councils that are refusing to have a local inquiry and a local investigation into the crimes that went on. So we've got this bizarre situation of people who prioritise fiction over reality, and people who will tell us, including the Prime Minister, how much they are emotionally moved and how much they will cry in response to a fictional TV show with a propaganda purpose, but don't seem to be emotionally moved by the real and genuine mass rape of British children. And that's the real problem here. You know, it's a deflection from the real issues and the real harms, you know, whether that's Islamic terrorists stabbing little children, little girls, as precipitated the Southport riots, or whether it's Islamic terrorists blowing up the Manchester Arena, you know, with the Manchester Arena bombing, which was targeting children again, because most of the fans there were children accompanied by adults. You're
referring to the Ariana Grande.
Yeah. They you know, most of the victims of that were children. You know, the Southport killer, his victims were children. The girls who were mass raped on an industrial scale for over 30 years in this country, while the authorities covered it up and did nothing about it, were children. You know, so if we're talking about harms to children, we have far too many real examples that this government is doing nothing about, and it has, you know, when they've been in power, has made worse. At the moment, they're refusing to hold an inquiry into grooming gangs. Jess Phillips the other day tried to sneak out an announcement to that effect, because they did promise before the last election, they promised they would hold an inquiry, aged on that promise. And they're doing everything still that they can to sweep it all under the carpet and to say, let's move on, let's ignore it. Well, you know, these rape gangs are still operating in many places around our country. They haven't effectively tackled the problem. They've put some of the members away. Some of those people that they imprisoned are already being released. You know, the leader of, I believe, the Rotherham, the main Rotherham rape gang has just been released yesterday, I think it was. He served 9 years. He had at least 15 victims, most of them around the age of 11. They gang raped them for 10 years and used them as sexual slaves for 10 years. And he's just been released after a 9-year sentence. And that is a case of someone who they did actually bother to catch. There's many, many more that they didn't bother to catch. And at the same time, they're telling us that we should care about Adolescence, a TV show.
The TV drama that's not a documentary, and I have written a few things. I have written a few things down here which are out there. It's just it's historical fact. So immediately, when it comes to the Labour Party, for argument's sake, and then let's also not take the previous government off the hook, and for 14 years as well, because they should have been pushing this inquiry, that inquiry, etc., etc. They're fully aware. But Daniel, I've written down the paedophile information exchange. I've written down Patricia Hewitt. I have written down MPs' behaviour, people that have been caught for doing inappropriate behaviour. We think of then recently MPs, a particular MP that was arrested a few days ago with allegations. We're just saying there are allegations that has to be proven, but that was the man that took Rees-Mogg's seat in Somerset, and
it was also the man. Just to interrupt a second, we've just had 2 Labour MPs who are being investigated for child sex crimes or child sex crime related matters. So child pornography, for example, or child sex crimes. And one of those was actually accompanied Keir Starmer when do you remember the famous incident when Keir Starmer was during COVID ejected from a pub by a landlord who didn't want to interact with him? Absolutely. Well, accompanying Keir Starmer on that occasion was a Labour MP who's now accused of sex crimes against children. So these aren't people who are in the best position to be telling us what is healthy and beneficial for our children.
No, not at all. And especially when they make statements, and I think a previous Prime Minister has made a statement along these lines, when they turn around and go, these white working class girls have made a lifestyle choice.
Yep. I mean, that's the disgusting attitude that was put across by social services. There was a member of the social services who not only turned a blind eye to the rape and abuse that was going on, but attended the wedding of one of these child victims, the Islamic wedding of one of these child victims. There were police who turned family members away. There were, there's now allegations that police actually took part. There were police officers who took part in the rapes. So this is a systemic and massive failure, but it's more than a failure. It's a betrayal from the establishment, from the institutions of the country. And at one and the same time now, we're being told that we should trust these people on a whole range of issues that are completely unrelated to this one. So we should trust them on climate change. We should trust them on digital IDs. We should trust them on the Ukraine war and whether we need to be heavily involved in that. We should trust them on whether we, side with Donald Trump or whether we side with China on tariff wars. All these other issues, we're told that these people are the kind of respectable authorities that we should listen to. And even, when we're told to obey various laws that become more and more draconian on us, we're told you just shut up, keep your head down, obey the laws and do as you're told. While you're paying more and more taxes, while your country's going to the dogs, while you can see around you everything getting worse, you are just there to kind of be this kind of drone-like slave and obey what you're told while your rights are taken away. And at the same time, they have enacted possibly the most obvious and the most severe betrayal that's imaginable. you know, a system that won't protect your children from mass rape is a system that has lost all legitimacy. You know, what kind of democratic mandate do they have as far as working class white people who are the primary victims of these rape gangs? You know, how are we supposed to look at them and think that they are legitimate authorities anymore when they refuse to
absolutely. And we raise and say, where is their moral code? They don't seem to. They don't seem to have one. And I just want to throw a interesting. The comment you made about digital IDs is absolutely fascinating. Again, because Mr. Blair suddenly, there he is. He may not be verbalizing it, but we can see the influence, and we remember his when he got together with I think Douglas Haig or Haig. Where William Hague, sorry, the man that stepped down so that Sunak.
Yeah, William Hague is probably worth forgetting. William Hague, really.
Well, the thing is that Blair's suddenly this whole push to say, well, look, we've got all this mass immigration coming in, which they are allowing. So this means that we need digital ID for everyone else who's objecting to this. No, we just need to deal with this issue. So they're then
I mean, it's classic kind of it's classic. You know, it's called the Hegelian dialectic. You know, they create a problem in order to get the solution that they want. And you know, there are very easy solutions to mass immigration, which they refuse to do, and which, you know, Trump is trying to do in the US. So your solutions to mass immigration and to kind of issues like Muslim rape gangs is mass deportation. You have to have mass deportation, and only Rupert Lowe is really being honest about that. You know, if people are a threat to your existing citizens, they have to be removed from the country. If there are international agreements, so for example, EU-based ones or international law-based ones, directives of the UN, for example, if they are in the way of you protecting your own citizens, you leave those agreements. You remove yourself from those agreements, you remove your agreements, and you begin the work of deporting people who are a danger to your own citizens.
And also, the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah, you leave the European Court of Human Rights. You say you no longer have jurisdiction over us. You know, we voluntarily agreed to let you have that jurisdiction. We are now removing ourselves from it because it's been harmful to our citizens. That allows you legally to deal with the issues that you need to deal with. So you remove yourself from all of those agreements. At the same time, you remove the incentive for people coming here. You know, if you seriously want to tackle mass immigration, you are not going to be putting people in hotels immediately and paying them money and feeding and funding them. A curious idea that the tiny United Kingdom needs to offer asylum to the entire population of the globe. You can simply, again, withdraw from any agreements that force you to do that, and stop doing it. It's very, very simple. You stop doing it, and you know, remove the incentive of people knowing that those protections are there waiting for them when they get to this country. So Daniel, you no longer take out contracts with hotels to house these people. You introduce new legislation that says that, say, for example, nobody is entitled to automatically entitled to asylum of any kind, no matter what the circumstances of their own country are. You have it legislation, or you revise legislation so that people can't claim welfare until they've contributed for a minimum period of time. So, for example, you would say, unless you've been contributing for 10 years, there's no welfare available for you. There's no housing welfare, there's no benefits, there's no food allowance, nothing. And you advertise that. Combine that with seriously using the Navy to patrol the Channel, and we would see a massive decline in the problem of the invasion of dinghies, for example, and illegal entries into the country. You know, Trump signalled a strong border policy. As soon as he signalled a strong border policy, illegal border crossings dropped by 90%. That happened in both terms. It's happened immediately now he's back in, and it happened in his first term as well. Australia introduced a very strict policy of intercepting boats, intercepting dinghies, removing those people immediately. Australia saw a massive drop in illegal entries. You know, it works and it's simple, and our government could do it if they wanted to, but they don't want to. The Conservatives didn't want to, and the Labour Party definitely don't want to.
You raised an important point, which I've written down here. So let's just remind ourselves who signed the Global Migration Compact and oversaw that under Theresa May. The other thing is the whole nut zero nonsense. She signed that, put that into legislation before she left as well. And just for my American viewers, listeners, she then goes under the auspices of calling herself a conservative and part of the Conservative Party. They are not. They are complete centrists, if not.
If you look at something like, absolutely, the last Conservative Party betrayed us for 14 years. The ordinary British people. They didn't deal with mass immigration, which has been a problem since World War II. Since World War II, we were initially told that this mass immigration is needed to cover the losses of men during World War II. So it's to make up the gaps in your economy from people who died in World War II. Well, I think we've had long enough to make up the gaps in the economy from people who died in World War II, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Our population is much higher than it was then. And that was essentially a lie anyway. We could have extended working in other ways. We could have dealt with that issue in other ways. And the losses that we'd suffered weren't severe enough to warrant mass immigration. But we decided that we would allow virtually everyone into the UK. But even then, until Tony Blair, those numbers were sort of trotting along. They were getting worse and worse. They had demographically changed the UK, but polling after polling for sort of 80 years has said that most people don't agree with letting anyone settle in your country. But they weren't at the levels that they've been in the last 20 years. The real opening of the floodgates came with the new Labour government of Tony Blair. So they went out and it went from, we're going to do this thing as surreptitiously as we can, and we're going to tell you this is a good thing, and we're going to ignore the negative effects, to we're actively going out and we're recruiting people to come here from abroad. And we are, as Tony Blair's speechwriter at the time said that they'd agreed in private meetings, they were going to rub the right's noses in diversity. So it was deliberate policy, and they were actually recruiting people to come here. They wanted open borders. They wanted totally unrestricted movement of people into the UK, regardless of who those people were and whether they would actually contribute. And if you look at the kind of research done by groups like Migration Watch, even the economic argument for it, even before you get into the cultural argument about the effects of this, the economic argument for it you get from the mainstream, that these people fill jobs that would otherwise not be filled, that these people are of great benefit to the UK and sustain our economy, is untrue, because the majority of unskilled migrants become a drain on your economy. They are claiming benefits in one way or another. They are not contributing. It's only very high skilled people in particular occupations where we have a kind of training shortfall that you could say, yes, they're obviously of benefit when they come in. And that's not true of most of the areas we are told we need these workers for. So all of it is based on lies. All of it has radically changed the nature of the country. And all of it has had, building consequences, of which the, mass rape of white children by primarily Pakistani descended men is the most glaring and the most obvious and most hideous example. And, the taking it back to adolescence, the thing that's so disgusting about this kind of hysteria that's been generated by Labour MPs and by the media about we must clamp down on online content that's affecting young boys. We must deal with people like Andrew Tate, for example, or we must demand ID requirements of people using the internet. Well, those are going to affect adults as well as children.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's monitoring again of the kind of online presence of every adult. And is that necessary? No. What would solve the harms, the primary real harms to children much more effectively is dealing with mass immigration, being honest about where most harms are coming from and dealing with those issues first. There may be online content that you should legitimately have to restrict. If it's outright calls to seeing all women as sexual objects, or if it's outright calls to sexual slavery, or content of that nature which aligns with terrorist content, for example, then yes, it's sensible to restrict access to that by children or by adults even. But that's not what's happening really. What's happening really is that the fabrication of a huge problem related to the issue of what our children are receiving online.
Yeah.
The fictional fabrication of that issue is to deflect from the real causes of harm and the real problems. And also along the way to justify further clampdowns on ordinary people and further monitoring of ordinary people. So if somebody was proposing a task force, for example, police task force dedicated to online grooming and dedicated to exposing people who have accessed child porn, every normal person would support that. But they're not. What they advocate in response to these issues is they advocate the restriction of everyone, and they advocate going after online content by empowering Ofcom, for example, even more, which is an unelected quango, or by going after platforms that they disagree with. And the real reason they're going after those platforms most of the time, for example, the current Labour Party argument with certain US social media platforms is based around political issues, based around those platforms allowing more honesty than the government does on political issues, including grooming gangs.
Absolutely. And just to put certain things in another context for everyone, whatever people think of GB News, which is supposed to be then right of centre, then within our thinking, I'll just leave it like that. But when you reach a situation where the Welsh Assembly bans GB News being shown within its buildings, I just want to just say that. The other thing as well, you're absolutely right in regard to bringing control. Maybe we need to remind Jackie Smith, who now has this role within the Labour Party again coming back. We need to remind her about what they claimed in regard to what her husband was watching and what they put through
Yes.
her expenses in the past. Egypt, the reason I'm saying that, not to be clever, is that we have got to keep on top of this. People have very short memories and they forget this. And the other thing I want to say to you, Daniel, make a comment, is that we've got to remember, we've got to look at this and question David Cameron, Osborne, going off to China. What relationships are there that these people may have? Other people, we look at the whole Huawei deal. I think it was Ben Wallace that was sacked because he actually raised this. I think he was
Yeah.
defense minister at the time. Just to remind ourselves that this is murky. There needs to be far more of an investigation into this. What are these people's relationships here with the CCP, for argument's sake?
Well, yeah, I'm sure most people, when Labour Party connections with the paedophile information exchange were happening, I'm sure most people were completely unaware of that.
Yes.
You know, so and when today Keir Starmer, pontificates about what we should do to protect children, there is probably still quite a lot of people in the country who don't know the role that Keir Starmer played as the Director of Public Prosecutions in effectively helping to cover up grooming gangs. Prosecutors were told not to go after, by the Home Office, were told not to go after these grooming gangs effectively. And that was a huge betrayal. Now, the argument that you'd get is that's a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. The argument you'd get is that there wasn't sufficient evidence in these cases. Well, they didn't go and that's what Keir Starmer was essentially saying to lawyers beneath him when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. There isn't sufficient evidence for these cases. The witnesses are we can't trust these witnesses for the reasons that the police outlined as well. Saying that they had willingly elected to be prostitutes. Well, they were children. No child willingly elects for any sexual engagement under our current law. So that should have been completely immaterial. Those kind of prejudicial attitudes towards these white working class children, because they were primarily from poor backgrounds, and I think there was a huge degree of snobbery involved in it as well. So it goes from the scale of their ignoring ordinary people and ignoring harms to ordinary people, to their own behaviour and how unchallenged and uninvestigated that is. And it's largely uninvestigated because there's a consensus in the media as well. People should be howling about the unaccountability. The mainstream press should be howling about, you mentioned Larry Fink earlier, or Bill Gates having private meetings with our Prime Minister and none of the details of those meetings being disclosed. We know that Keir Starmer is purchasable. They'll say that that's slander if I say that. Well, we've got on record, people who are Labour Party donors providing him with gifts.
Yes.
And paying for his wife's clothing allowance. Well, I'm sorry, for me, that's bribery. Okay, it may, to protect myself legally here, it may be unproven whether he specifically did anything in response to those payments. But he received private payments that went to him and his wife from donors. All of that is incredibly dodgy, which is why in some instances they've paid this money back. Well, if that's how they behave with kind of known Labour donors, how are they behaving in private in meetings that we don't know anything about?
Because of his legal background, and he is a legalist, when he turned around and said, well, I'm returning X amount of money, that was within his definition of the law. So, well, I didn't step over this line, but push that. This is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Return everything instead of everything. It doesn't. Whatever people think, it doesn't look good, especially if you are giving a video talking about lockdowns, etc., but you happen to be in someone else's
On every
property.
yeah, on every level, they broke the lockdown rules that they initiated, and Keir Starmer was guilty of that, just the same as Boris Johnson. But Keir Starmer got away with it, and for some reason, media choice, effectively,
Yes,
there
yes,
wasn't the huge scandal about it that Boris faced. Well, you could say that Boris was Prime Minister at the time. Well, Keir Starmer was the leader of the opposition at the time, who had been asking for more severe lockdown measures, and he broke those rules himself. And there was no kind of comeback, no accountability for him whatsoever. So, we've got a Prime Minister who was Director of Public Prosecutions during the grooming gang scandal. So he was in charge. He should have been demanding action against these grooming gangs, and he was effectively doing the opposite. He is also someone who we know took gifts of thousands of pounds from Labour Party donors. He's also someone having private meetings with billionaires immediately before policy announcements from the Labour Party, and none of the details of those meetings are disclosed. And he's also someone who treats fictional TV shows as real, and real industrial scale mass rapes as fictional. So how can you endorse or support any of that?
absolutely,
How can you regard that Prime Minister as your legitimate Prime Minister who's looking out for the interests of your country? If you've got any sense whatsoever, you can't.
No. And I think I just want to say this, my opinion. So the Conservative MP that stood up and replied to what Jess Phillips said.
Yeah, Katie Lamb, I think it was.
Katie Lamb. Yeah, I thought it was an incredible speech and what she said. But there has been one individual that has been banging on about this issue for many years, who now resides in prison, which is Tommy Robinson. I think I just wish to state that, because these things should not be taken away from that individual, who I do believe is a political prisoner, and the case is building even more to affirm that, because of his views. No, we're gonna put him away, etc. And he is in solitary confinement, and frankly, he
absolutely.
needs
And his crime essentially is, he's been done on various things, but contempt of court has been used more often than anything else. And how could a rational person not have contempt for these courts? That would be my question.
Very good reply.
When they are giving very light sentences to child rapists, when the legal system is not going after child rapists because they're worried about a community reaction from Muslim communities, and at the same time they're giving far stricter sentences for hurty words online.
Yes.
How is anyone supposed to respect those courts or respect those judges? I don't respect them. I'm sure you don't respect them anymore. No. They are people who have betrayed us. They are people who have, who are imposing more and more draconian measures on our free speech, while at the same time they offer these suspiciously light sentences all the time to child rapists. So I'm sorry, I don't have any respect for a court that helps child rapists. And nor should Tommy Robinson have that respect for that court or anyone else. So that's the basic situation there. We've got an anarcho tyranny. We've got people who will go after us for our free speech, but won't go after child rapists. And this is a kind of monumental betrayal and a monumental evil from those people, whether they're politicians or whether they're judges, which is incredibly corrosive towards trust in your society and trust in your
Absolutely.
system.
Absolutely.
You know,
Because and then that perpetuates the breakdown. And the other comment I'd like to say is, I'm trying to sort of paraphrase or trying to get right the words of Douglas Murray when he made who's someone I respect, who made a comment and said Tommy Robinson may speak out about these issues. He was alluding to the fact that because of his background, then the establishment, no, we're going to write him off. Where because
yeah,
Douglas Murray, his background
Murray is right
is
on that. It's
thorny.
class
Yeah,
based, and
yeah,
the big threat
absolutely.
was not what has never been essentially that Tommy Robinson is lying. The big threat is that Tommy Robinson has been telling the truth.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
so for example, one of the times that Tommy Robinson was got into trouble with the police was when he released the names of some of the people who were in court. You know, so some of the people who were in court at that time, and they had also, the judge had said, we don't want reporting on this. So that's what got Tommy Robinson into trouble, because the mainstream media went along with that and didn't report it. But anyone at that time could have walked into that courtroom and seen those names on screens as the cases were going on. And all Tommy Robinson did essentially in that instance was stand outside and say what those names were. But that was considered to be so potentially damaging because all the names were the names you would expect of Pakistani Muslim rapists. That was supposed to be so damaging that you know, you could have a blanket injunction against it, and anyone releasing those names was then in trouble with the law. And
No,
that's
I
You
absolutely, and no, absolutely, and it's like, in a sense, it may sound horrible to say, but if people are suddenly saying, "Oh, we're going to jump on the bandwagon," it's really, really important to actually give credence, give respect to someone that has led this, exposing all this for years and years
you
and
know,
years.
absolutely, there's two things there. We need to give credit to Tommy Robinson for raising these issues for so long, and to keep doing so when he's been subject to state persecution and prosecution for doing so. So huge respect to him for that. But at the same time, I think if people are now coming round to being honest on these issues, as you know, Katie Lamb was honest in her absolutely brilliant response to Jess Phillips in the House of Commons. Well, you know, the tragic thing is that was one MP telling the truth. As it was with, you know, under COVID, we had Andrew Bridgen telling the truth, and everyone else was lying. And when he did so, there was hardly anyone bothered, other MPs bothered to attend. And similarly, when Jess Phillips, you know, snuck out this declaration that they were reneging on their promise to have an inquiry, it was largely empty. They tried to do it to an empty House of Commons, and Katie Lamb seems to have heard about this and rushed in and delivered an absolutely brilliant response.
It was barnstorming, and Jess Phillips, frankly,
and it was superb because it was, you know, it was unapologetically accurate and truthful.
Absolutely.
And
Jess Phillips,
you know, so much as I, like you, have been disgusted by the portrayal of the Conservative Party for many years, if one of them stands up and says something that's true, I'm gonna celebrate that. Because there's so few MPs still who will. And she very honestly said, you know, this was Pakistani descended Muslim men, and the victims were almost all, there were some Sikh victims, but the victims were almost all white working class children, and it was racially motivated. It seems to have been racially motivated. You know, we have all this stuff about racism awareness, all this stuff about, you know, how sensitive white people must now be towards ethnic minorities. Well, some of that is a good thing, you know, and you can say that in the past that there were attitudes that weren't good. But there's no sensitivity and there's no acknowledgement of the huge amounts of contemporary racism that goes on, because some of these grooming gang victims were being called white devils while they were being raped.
Yeah.
You know, some of them were. The reality is that it was religiously motivated, it was racially motivated. You know, these rapists saw these girls as inferior because they were white and because they were nominally Christian, because they were non-Muslim. You know, that's what made it okay in their twisted system of ethics for them to rape these children, then go back to their own families and think of themselves as good people.
Mm.
You know, they could gang rape these children because they were white working class. And, you know, to finally have an MP in the House of Commons showing that they seem to understand that is a very good thing. But so I'll give Katie Lamb individually credit for that, and I'll give a Conservative Party that's beginning to sound a little more stern and a little more realistic some credit for that as well.
Well, I hear you, and I think Badenoch that needs to speak out more about this, and also without getting into it, we need to, you know, where is Nigel Farage on this issue right now, Daniel? Yeah. Because that is another program in itself, and I think
it is. The strange
development
of Nigel Farage.
Yeah, we will have that
but
discussion.
Going back to the adolescence thing, sorry to interrupt you again.
No, not at all.
There's a Kemi Badenoch link to the adolescence thing, because we're now in a ludicrous situation where Kemi Badenoch in the mainstream media has got into trouble for essentially noticing the race swapping of the identity of the killer in the Netflix series. And, you know, Netflix are utterly notorious for race swapping roles. You know, they do it all the time. And they'll do it, you know, in something as absurd as making Anne Boleyn black, or they do it in something like making, you know, Edward the Sixth black, or something like, you know, known historical characters who were white are made black in their presentations. But they'll also do it in making sure that virtually everyone who is depicted as evil or depicted as a killer is white, and it happens all the time. You know, it's very, very obvious. And Kemi Badenoch mildly referenced it, you know, not as explicitly as you or I would, but she mildly referenced it, and then she's in trouble. So we've got this absurd thing that the Labour government isn't in mainstream media trouble for ignoring the real rape of white children. The mainstream Labour government is not in trouble with the press for prioritising fiction above reality. But Kemi Badenoch saying, isn't that a bit weird that you've swapped the races in this series? She gets into trouble. And that shows you, you know, what the agenda is, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And Daniel, we're in the last sort of couple of minutes, and I wanted to say something else, because I think we need to then discuss this. I will be having this discussion with someone else, and the fact that we reach a point where now we've got a legal firm that wishes to, where Hamas is designated as a terrorist group in this country, that we now have a legal firm that wants to challenge that to then reverse that. I'm ending on that for a deliberate reason, because you have wonderfully described the state of our nation. It's giving people the understanding of the lunacy and the madness that is actually going on. But Daniel, I just in the sort of last minute, is there any other further thoughts? And then I will play us out, sir. But thank you.
Well, probably one thing we didn't talk about in relation to adolescence is that the whole issue of gender politics and, you know, whether feminism has been helpful or harmful. And, you know, the adolescence fetish and the adolescence narrative is now saying that any criticism of feminism is unacceptable, and it's somehow linked to extremism. Well, there's
Really?
lots of ways in
Really?
which kind of, you know, third or fourth wave feminism is itself incredibly extremist. You've got feminist writers who talk about mass sterilization of boys.
Yeah.
You've got
Yeah.
feminist writers who talk about, you know, wanting abortion of all boys. You know, so there are branches of feminism that aren't particularly rational and are quite extreme. And we're now saying, apparently, that kind of, just as we say that racism only flows in one direction and you only have to worry about racism towards ethnic minorities, whilst white people are being treated appallingly. We do the same thing on gender, and we pretend that you know, there are no problems with how we treat boys. There are no problems with how our society treats men. Well, there are problems. That's why people like Andrew Tate have become popular, you know, because we do say to boys, essentially, more and more, you're worthless. And we say that especially to white working class boys, which is why a thing like Adolescence is going to have the opposite effect to the one it supposedly intends.
I couldn't agree more, and I do apologize to jump in and say it's been amazing. No, Daniel, I cannot thank you enough, and we're going to be doing more and more of this, where we have to have these discussions and lay this out. And I want to thank you for your brain and just how you articulate and in such a brilliant way, because this is really, really important. Daniel, I'm gonna end it. I'm just gonna say thank you so much for your time. I'm gonna play us out. Please stay on the other side so I can just make sure it's all okay.
Sure,
And say
it's been a
goodbye to you.
pleasure.
No, it's been brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for watching, listening, and see you soon.